The year is 2025, and you're probably wondering if the Yellowstone supervolcano is going to blow its lid this year. You may have heard some people talking about how it could happen in 2025 because of a recent paper published in the Bulletin of Volcanology that says so. But here's the deal. Scientists say the likelihood of a massive eruption at Yellowstone National Park remains extremely low, even over the next 10,000 years. So what gives? Is there any reason to worry about the famous supervolcano, or can we all go back to worrying about something else? So when I heard about this new paper, my first thought was, hey, scientists just found magma under the parking lot at Old Faithful. What does that mean? And to answer that question, I got in touch with one of the study's authors, Professor Michael Poland from the United States Geological Survey. Yellowstone sits atop a massive hotspot in the Earth's mantle. That's a place where the rock is hotter than normal, and it's been steadily melting the rock in the Earth's crust since long before humans evolved. All those hot springs and geysers are proof of that. But every couple 100,000 years or so, the pressure builds up enough to blow, and we get this massive eruption. We call these super eruptions, but don't worry too much about definitions yet. I'll explain more later. The last one happened about 640,000 years ago and left behind the massive magma chamber that's still there today. Because magma chambers are not permanent fixtures in the Earth's crust. They disappear over time as the magma slowly cools and hardens into solid rock. Now, after a super eruption, it takes tens of thousands of years for enough pressure to build up to cause another explosion. But researchers don't know exactly how long it takes. There's no way to measure the pressure building under the ground, and until they can only guess. So this is the problem that Professor Poland and his colleagues set out to solve. How long do we have before the next super eruption at Yellowstone? Their best estimate was 13,000 years, which is about twice as long as humans have been around. But there's a range of possible timescales. It could be as little as 3,000 years or as much as 20,000 years. In other words, it could happen within our lifetimes, or we might have some breathing room. You may be thinking, okay, let's assume that it won't happen in my lifetime, but how long is a human lifetime anyway? Well, the average life expectancy in the US is just over 78 years. But Professor Paul said that he doesn't base his estimate of 13,000 years on the lifespan of an average American. Instead, he thinks about the lifespan of cultures. He said, how long will human civilization survive if there is a mega city at the site of Yellowstone? And then he came up with 13,000 years. But now you may be thinking, wait, why would humans need to abandon the area around Yellowstone after the next eruption? Wouldn't we just evacuate like we do for hurricanes and earthquakes? Well, it turns out that a Yellowstone super eruption wouldn't be like a hurricane or an earthquake. Those are relatively small events compared to a super eruption. We're talking about an eruption that ejects more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of material into the air. For comparison, the largest historical eruption was Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991, which ejected about 5 cubic kilometers of ash and pumice. Even so, Pinatubo caused billions of dollars in damages and hundreds of deaths. But if it had been the same size as Yellowstone's last super eruption, well, no one would be alive today to clean up the mess. During a super eruption, hot gas and ash would shoot high into the atmosphere and spread around the world. Ash would fall over large parts of North America, causing widespread crop failure. Pyroclastic flows, lahars, and floods would devastate everything around Yellowstone. Solid pieces of rock called tephra would rain down for weeks or months and bury whole towns under meters of ash. The skies would turn dark as night, and temperatures would plummet. In short, this would be a global catastrophe, and we haven't had one of these since the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs. Now, I don't want to make light of this, but in a way, it sounds kind of fun. Would it be really bad for humans? Yes, but it would also be great for humans because it would wipe out most of the bison and elk in the area. And we all know how those guys feel about us humans. Okay, so it turns out that there's no chance that anything big will happen at Yellowstone anytime soon. But just in case you were worried, I asked Professor Poland whether or not there are any signs that something big is coming. His answer was a definitive no. However, there are signs that something small is coming. A magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck near the park in 1985, which was the largest earthquake in the contiguous United States since 1968. Since then, there have been thousands of smaller earthquakes in the area, but none of them have been big enough to signal an impending supereruption. And no, this is not an example of an unclustered event. However, researchers did find a pattern in the timing of these earthquakes. According to a study published in Frontiers in Earth Science in 2022, the majority of earthquakes occurred during the winter months between December and February. Professor Poland says that these earthquakes are just normal tectonic activity along the fault lines in the area. He says there are three main faults that cut across the caldera floor. One runs roughly north to south, one runs east to west, and the third cuts across the southeastern corner. All three of these faults are locked in place where they meet in the middle because of the sheer amount of magma underneath. But they're still moving independently of each other, and as the faults move, they release energy in the form of earthquakes. This is similar to what happens along the San Andreas Fault in California, except that the San Andreas Fault is a transform boundary where two plates are sliding past each other. The faults under Yellowstone are strike-slip faults where the plates are sliding vertically. That means that instead of releasing their energy by making the land slide horizontally, they release it by pushing the land up or down, which causes uplift and subsidence. Uplift and subsidence are pretty common in Yellowstone. Between 1872 and 1985, the region experienced several periods of uplift and subsidence. The greatest change was an uplift of about 30 centimeters, which is about a foot. Subsidence tends to be slower than uplift, though, and the largest period of subsidence, which occurred between 1985 and 1986, dropped the land by about 40 centimeters or 16 inches. In total, the land has subsided about 60 centimeters or 2 feet since 1985. Professor Paul says this is perfectly normal and part of the earthquake cycle. It's not surprising that there have been so many small earthquakes, but what about the big ones? Could we see a large earthquake before there's a supereruption? Well, according to another paper published in Frontiers in Earth Science, not likely. Using data from the Yellowstone Seismic Network, researchers looked at the frequency of large earthquakes in the area over the last 30 years. Their results, which were published in 2022, showed that the largest earthquakes were rare, with an average recurrence interval of about 200 years. The largest earthquake in the last 30 years was a magnitude 7.3, which is not the threshold for a supereruption. In fact, the threshold for a large earthquake at Yellowstone is less than half the threshold for a supereruption. If you recall, a supereruption is anything larger than 1,000 cubic kilometers, so the threshold for a large earthquake is about 400 cubic kilometers. But hold on, because it gets more complicated. Scientists don't actually agree on the exact definition of a supereruption. Some think it should be anything larger than 1,000 cubic kilometers. Others think it should be anything larger than 10,000 cubic kilometers. By the broadest definition, Yellowstone hasn't had a supereruption in 2.1 million years. But by the strictest definition, it hasn't had one in 640,000 years. And the evidence suggests that there's no imminent risk of either happening anytime soon. Still, it's good to keep tabs on Yellowstone. There are all kinds of crazy things that could happen there, like an earthquake that releases enough energy to break the crust on a nearby magma chamber and trigger a massive eruption. But based on the evidence, it's just not going to happen in my lifetime or yours. So can we all go back to worrying about something else now? Well, yes, but I don't know what that something else should be. Any ideas? Let me know in the comments below. As always, it's me. And thank you for watching this CTI Show video.